Hello all. Sorry, Hannah, for being obnoxious in the chat box while you were presenting, but there it is. It's truly an honor to be here today and also to present alongside all of these amazing papers that I feel like have really, really wonderful overlap. So good job, conference organizers. I'll begin. Once again, my paper title is The Lucky Victim, Current Rape Narratives in the Virgin Daughter of Judges 19. The uprising of memoirs and testimonies that are breaking the silence in the midst of the burgeoning culture of #MeToo have been both damning and simultaneously empowering. What was once a trickle of willingly unheard stories has become a tidal wave that is not to be ignored, a true reckoning of the devastation that occurs when abuse and the ideologies that perpetuate abuse go unchecked. Yet, the aforementioned trickle still involves the plethora of narratives that contain these violent abuses, needing to be revisited, such as the story of Judges 19. While recent commentators, hi Helen, have done a great job amplifying this story, the only victim in the story typically that is discussed is the concubine. She, however, is not the only one in the story who is victimized. And no, this is not a paper discussing the potential victimhood of the Levite. Scholars have rarely mentioned anything about the other woman in the dark tale, the virgin daughter of the old man. While the Levite's potential victim status has been mentioned in scholarship, this survivor is often left out. She, like the concubine, is silent in the text, barely there, except for a key moment in which everything changed for her. She is one of two women readily offered up to the men of wickedness outside her home, but offered up by her own father. In using the words written by Alice Sebold in her own post-abuse memoir to give voice to the daughter, quote, "My life was over. My life had just begun," end quote. Using a feminist lens, this paper will explore the real implications of purity culture in ancient Near Eastern contexts, specifically in the text of Judges 19, as well as in our current context. From these findings, the paper will show how this ideology carried out not only perpetuates and goes hand in hand with rape culture, creating a blame-shifting narrative that escalates into the creation of a hierarchy of victimhood. Both rape culture and purity are constructs that other, ultimately as tools of the patriarchy. This paper will reread the text of Judges 19, while abhorrent and grotesque, as still a subversive narrative that critiques these contexts and ideologies, begging for others to hear the silenced and thus bear witness for repentance and change. Rape is a weapon of power and violence, not necessarily one of sexuality, though it involves sex. In regard to rape culture, it is, as Roxane Gay remarks in her anthology on the subject, quote, "What it is like to live in a culture where it often seems like it is a question of when, not if, a woman will encounter some kind of sexual violence," end quote. Within the same anthology, Lynn Melnick writes of her own experience of this that is often overlooked. She was holding hands with her daughter outside of the library before leaving to go home. Ben is catcalled, using words I do not necessarily feel comfortable adding to the pages of this document. The offender speeds away after offending her, after objectifying her, and making her feel entirely unsafe. Her story continues. Quote, "I turn around and make eye contact with a cop standing outside the library. I gesture to him like, 'What the hell?' And he gestures back like, 'What can you do?' I don't know. You're just a cop and someone made me feel unsafe on the street. Never mind. I was wearing a sundress. It's not like he touched you. It's not like he hurt you. It's not like he raped you. I'm supposed to be grateful because I wasn't raped," end quote. In rape culture, there are no consequences for these actions. These actions that are violent towards those who receive them are excused away, at least the refrain of the day, normal behavior. Even in the proverbial tidal wave that is seemingly happening currently, too few people are actually convicted for rape itself. Rape culture is so deeply enmeshed with the supposed justice system, in which a biased rationale is created, used, and accepted for why Lynn deserved to get catcalled. Why? She wore a sundress. What happened was not that bad. For this reason, among others, there is an unknown and large amount of people who do not disclose their abuse. However, we are making an unfortunate connection today between rape culture and purity culture that needs further discussion, especially in regard to how it is wielded using biblical texts in sacred spaces and places. To attempt to define purity culture, Katie Cross, in her study on the trauma of purity culture, writes that, quote, generally speaking, purity culture manifests most clearly in conservative Christian communities. It is deeply ensconced and established in evangelical traditions. The central tenets of purity culture include, but are not limited to, the restriction of all sexual activity to heterosexual marriage, an emphasis on modesty and sexual purity, and abstinence-only education, end quote. What's important in Cross's research is that she connects this to something she calls body theodicy, arguing that it can be understood as something that becomes trapped or embedded in women's bodies as a result of purity culture. The above definition has been coded in fear-based metaphors to those who may cross these lines, becoming chewed up gum and stomped on roses, explicitly unwanted by anyone. This ideology also does not account for abuse. The irony is that the ideology claims to be protecting those who adhere to it, but it ultimately places blame and responsibility on women and their bodies for whatever could, rather will, occur. The shame created by this theology and ideology impacts real bodies. For this reason, Emily Joy Allison calls purity culture the spiritual corollary of rape culture, in that this shame makes abuse that has already occurred worse, and actually sets the stage for abuse to be more widespread than it otherwise would be, as silence is better than speaking up when these are the rules. What is striking about this statement on purity culture, especially as it is mainly upheld in evangelical circles, is the notion that these spaces are supposed to be safe havens, even countercultural, especially for the most vulnerable. Yet Beth Allison Barr notes that it is essentially these tools of the patriarchy, particularly ones that work to keep women's voices silent, that are actually a copycat of the world we live in today. She writes, my modern students balk at how Babylonian law allowed husbands to drown their wives for alleged adultery. But my students are also living in the state of Texas, in which women make up 94% of the victims in domestic partner murder-suicides. Not to mention the United States, in which almost 25% of women have experienced severe physical violence by an intimate partner. This evidence shows not only the continuity of patriarchy from ancient Mesopotamia to modern America, but also the continuity of its dark underbelly. Barr continues to show examples of how the methods and madness of the patriarchy have shape-shifted throughout the decades, including what she calls sanctifying purity, a move that came out of 19th century anxieties of social and economic changes, a firm reminder that patriarchy moves hand in hand to uphold militarism, racism, oppression, and hierarchy. Well-known researchers on purity culture, Jessica Valenti and Sarah Maslener, agree wholeheartedly in that many of these anxieties in the modern ages involving purity culture came out of white anxieties, a significant strategy for evangelicals facing the gain or loss of their own cultural capital, linking sexual deviancy and national decline, and of course, declining Anglo-Saxon privilege. Levon Proverbs Biggs, who works with women of color who are survivors of sexual assault, specifically mentions purity culture in an interview with Allison as steeped in white supremacy, as the image that comes up for the virtuous woman, as was said earlier, is white and chaste. Black women's bodies have been hypersexualized for millennia. Bifurcating women of all colors into pure and maternal via the cult of domesticity, where then one easily demonizes prostitutes and sex work, those on the other side of the binary, or simply for wearing a sundress, has been patriarchy's tool that has kept women under the thumb of subordination, their bodies homes for trauma, following them unto death. even more so for women of color and sexual minorities. Melnick finishes her chapter in the anthology by adding, quote, "Once or twice in my life, I swear to you, I've done things other than be a body available for men to enjoy or reject. But I know I have no right to complain. I'm lucky. I've been allowed one more day as a woman on this earth, relatively unviolated. Shouldn't that be enough? Lucky, lucky, lucky," end quote. Seeing these ideologies then operating in an infamous rape text in the Hebrew Bible is rather seamless. Judges 19 is the story of a concubine who leaves her husband for abundantly speculated reasons, namely due to the verb used to describe her act of leaving, zonah, another word for prostituting. Unfaithful. Later in the story, she is gang raped by the citizens of Gibeah and then dismembered by her own spouse. In tandem with the already exhausted conversations on rape culture in this specific text, Isabel Hamley poses the question, would she be less of a victim had she been promiscuous? Rape culture answers yes to this question, alongside many commentators and scholars who participate in the violent act that Cheryl Exum calls being raped by the pen. The blame for her zonahing in the beginning of the narrative thus merits the horrifying acts that happen to the concubine. Yet Hamley also poses this as a challenging question to even feminist interpreters, who explain readily that the term in this context obviously means that she left him due to abuses. Being unfaithful only means going back to her father's house. It doesn't mean prostituting. Even feminists are so steeped in patriarchal culture that they seek to make her pure enough so that she didn't deserve the act of gang rape and dismemberment to occur. And using the words of Lacey Crawford, who herself was unbelieved in her own rape case due to the fact that she had been sexually active at the time, quote, "To believe in the perfect victim is to believe in no victim at all," end quote. Again, she is not the only victim in this story. The virgin daughter, her very name giving the title favored in a patriarchal society, is also objectified and offered to the men of wickedness outside her home, which is supposed to be safe, by her own father. She certainly doesn't die, she doesn't get raped, she doesn't get touched. In this comparison, she's certainly lucky. But as Crawford notes, it's a bitter term, evidence of how the same words have different meanings to a victimized woman and a world inclined to deny trauma. It is Crawford who actually compares her own story to Siebold's, as she envies her for not only being attacked by a stranger as opposed to the attacker that she knew, she also envies Siebold's virginity, as that gift of innocence stolen would make her more favorable in court. This paper does not want to dismiss any form of trauma, even if what occurred is not that bad in comparison. Lyrae Van Cleef Stephanon writes a poem based on this chapter from the point of view of the women. And as the virgin daughter looks on as the concubine is thrown out, she speaks 3 times over, "It could have easily been me. Lucky, lucky, lucky." Relationally, there are many breakdowns between each of the members in this story, but most particular in the case of the virgin daughter between herself and her father. Miki Ball adds that there's an intrinsic bond between the idea of virginity, the competition between fathers and next generation men, and the extreme violence that takes the form of ritual sacrifice. In the eyes of the patriarchal context, she is the best and most pure sacrifice, highly desired. The virgin is the same side of the binary for women besides wife and mother, inhabiting a space of the complementary ideal of the feminine, described erotically as ripe and unblemished fruit. Phyllis Bird continues that this is simply the same ideal viewed from the perspective of male control underlying the legal stipulations regarding women's sexuality. Unfortunately, when this occurs, there is the creation of a narrative and systems that affirm that there are women who do not deserve to be raped, and some be those on the other end of the binary who do. The virgins are both desired and protected to some relative degree, seen as innocent. Within rape culture and purity culture, the question must be asked, what did the virgin daughter do to deserve this? Van Cleef Stephanon's poem starts the daughter's portion of the poem with the very words, Suddenly, I am a stranger in my father's house. For the father to offer his daughter up, unmarried, virginal, would mean that she would potentially have to marry the rapists who are pounding at the door, which remains wide open to them. This, for obvious reasons, not ideal for more likely all parties concerned, except for maybe the father, in that he is absolved of some roles and costs in the daughter's life. He essentially others his own daughter for what seems could be his own benefit. Julia O'Brien, in her book that discusses problematic metaphors, most often in prophetic texts, says that in this patriarchal context, to be forever a daughter is to remain ever dependent on and vulnerable to others, defenseless when those in control fail to offer protection and care. Ironically, there is not much of a difference between the elderly male host and the father of the concubine, two men who are mainly contrasted by commentators via in their modes of hospitality. But they both failed to protect their daughters, seeking instead to protect the Levite, the man, the guest. Some attempt to make a case in using the parallel narrative in Genesis 19, debating the honor and shame codes of ancient Near Eastern patriarchal contexts said to keep women safe, but really only control them and make them expendable in protecting the male figures. Mitzi Smith speaks on patriarchal societies and the ownership of women's bodies in light of Judges 19, stating, quote, "Patriarchal societies teach that it is the right of men to have access to women's bodies to satisfy their desires, that their rage is justified when what they've been taught they are entitled to is not given freely. Rape is an act of hostility and violence and not a crime of passion, even and especially when men and women rape their wives or traffic and expose their wives and daughter to others in order to protect their own bodies and manhood," end quote. Arguing within this passage as the interplay of patriarchal ideologies rear their ugly head does not have to be an either-or conversation, where then the men must be the ones willing to be harmed on behalf of the women inside the home. Rape and violence must be resisted and abolished everywhere, where it doesn't happen to anyone. A feminist ethos seeks to see and hear those who are unseen and unheard, and it is of great necessity to notice that God himself identifies with the women in this passage. While seemingly nowhere to be found, God implements a silence that protests. I interpret this passage as an ideological indictment towards the patriarchal context that perpetuates these actions, ones that create hierarchies of fabricated worthiness. Exum adds, it is men in this story who bring death and who shift the blame onto women through an encoded message that holds women responsible for male aggression. So this would not be the time to add the hashtag not all men. Resisting the patriarchy benefits everyone. Famously, the chapter ends by stating what I view as ironic given a whole reading of Judges, but something to still yet heed. Think her over, discuss her, and speak up. Today, we bear witness to the many stories told and the stories that have yet to be told. Will we allow these stories to change us? The author of Judges hopes so, alongside with us. Ending with words from survivor and author Crawford, quote, "In bearing witness, we're trying to correct a theft of power via a story. But power and stories, while deeply interconnected, are not the same things. One is a rock, the other is water. Over time, long periods of time, water always wins. What I want to know even now is how." Thank you.
Thank you, Alexiana. That was wonderful. Very illuminating thoughts. And thank you for bringing a much needed focus on the other woman in Judges 19. I think most papers on Judges 19 go on and on about the text, but I think you've added something very valuable here. If you have a question for Alexiana, please put it in the chat, or you can be like Helen and just raise your hand. No, we'll give her. Helen, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you so much, Alexiana. That was really, really interesting. Appreciated that. I've been thinking a little bit about fungibility, about bodies that are interchangeable for one another. And I think I see quite a lot of that in the Hebrew narratives, whether it's wives swapping with each other. There's a whole lot of stuff going on there. And I was wondering if you see any of that in this narrative and whether that plays in. I appreciate this wasn't quite the focus of your paper, so I'm not trying to trick you. I'm just wondering, just kind of having a wonder out loud, really.
Oh, good wonder out loud. I have not given much thought to that until you have just now asked that question. And that's really intriguing to consider in light of this. Oh,
sorry. Yeah. No, I think I've thrown in a red herring. Please ignore.
No, please send me that via email. I would love to chat further about that, because that is incredibly intriguing to me.
Helen's just trying to deal with the question.
No comment.
Helen's just trying to get back at you for the sass.
I don't blame her. I do not blame her.
No. Joanna asks, can the virgin daughter be brought into dialogue with Lot's daughters too?
Oh, I absolutely think so. I originally cut a bunch of stuff involving the parallelism as Lot's daughters are sort of offered up, and then actually in turn you could sort of, while it's also this act of, in some case, weirdness after the fact where Lot's daughters sleep with him, it could also in some cases be a weird revenge fantasy, but that's
what I was getting at. I just wondered, because there's clearly so much of an echo between the two stories.
Yep. Like you just offered us up.
Yeah, exactly. And so I just wondered whether there is a kind of fantasy dimension there, where in terms of how the story then plays out in the Genesis version. And it's interesting. I've never really thought about it. So thank you for your presentation. But how she's just completely elided, and it's odd that she's there at all, isn't it? So thank you for drawing attention to her.
Thanks.
Jennifer has a question, and interesting enough, she gave a paper yesterday on Genesis 19.
She did. Sorry, I missed it.
Is the concubine then a parallel for Lot? So the concubine being a parallel for Lot, and the substitute for the virgin daughters?
I feel like the concubine would be a parallel for one of Lot's daughters, more so than it would have been for Lot. Lot's parallel would probably more likely either be the Levite, but most likely in this case, the old man host. So while they are extremely similar, they are also extremely dissimilar in certain aspects. So I view, and I'm not sure who's retelling who, but I think one of them is the original folk story, and then it's being retold, I think due to certain different circumstances that are occurring in historical context. Because in one story, God shows up. The messengers of Yahweh show up. Actually, they are the guests themselves, and they fix it. But where's God? In this one is a fun thing. So making the parallels, I think, is a little difficult, but also, the concubine would be more of a parallel for one of Lot's daughters, or Lot's daughters in general, just unfairly, barely there and thrown out. And the substitute for the virgin daughters.
What question for you would be, do you see the treatment of the bad dad, the guy later in the chapter who offered his daughter? Do you see his actions in distinction to the Levite's wife, the woman's own father? Do you see them as trying to be contrasted, or are they one and the same? Are they both? I
kind of read them as one and the same, to be honest. I think that's some of the blurriness of all of that, in that there's not really an easy answer here. You know, people contrast the hospitality narratives, right? Because this one's so lavish, it's so amazing, but maybe it also could be him trying to keep him there and control the Levite and trying to, but in essence, he still objectifies his own daughter. She's still just an object. And in the same light, that's sort of how the old man is, even though he's a little less willing to take them in, but don't stay in the square. So it sort of muddies the waters a bit, but I see them as very similar.
Maybe the point is to critique the nice forms of patriarchy and showing it the darker.
Yeah, he's okay.
Yeah,
but it still did the same thing as hashtag not all men. I'm sure that's what the one dad is saying. But
that's great. Now we're going to move to this time. Thank you so much, Alexiana. But we're going to move to